Well, good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. Very happy to have you all. We're going to be picking up, we got really deep into Genesis chapter 1 last week. We're going to be picking up where we left off in verse 2. So, last week we began our study in Genesis, and it was very important for us to establish a base point for the creation. And that is in the first 5 verses when we get the depiction of the first day of understanding that there is a lot that is happening there. And hopefully, if you were here last week, even if you didn't get everything we were talking about, hopefully it became apparent if you were here last week that there's a lot that happened as far as the physical creation in verses 1 through 3. We see that in verse 1 of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And sometimes we just read that and go, okay, he made creation. We didn't. Obviously, there is the simple idea of creation that is, our tangible world, but included in that, in the depth of that idea, is all the laws of physics, time, space, gravity, elements, all of those sorts of things that had to be created on that first day because it's part of our material world. And we spent a lot of time talking about what that means for the existence of God and the character of God, how if God created the universe, that he has to be one that is greater than the physical universe and outside of the laws that he made, the laws of our material reality or space and time. We talked a lot about time having beginning point and how the universe's origin has to have a start point. And then where we ended last week, we were talking about light and the complexity of the idea of light, that it's not just, we turn on, the light switch and then suddenly we can see, but rather that light is a band of rays that come from the radiation of what? How is light in our universe created? What do you need for it? You need the sun and the stars. And one of the things that is missing, because it doesn't come till later in creation, is there are no celestial bodies in verses 3 and 4. God simply says, let there be light, and there was light. Now, there's some very good arguments to be said that the source of light is God, but it could be just as we talked about last week, just as likely that God just snapped his fingers and there was light, because God has the power to do that. God is not bound by the laws of physics that he made because he is greater than those concepts. And so we're going to move forward this evening, and we're going to start out by talking about the idea of a day and verse 5, and then we're going to move into maybe the second day of creation, and maybe we'll get through the second day of creation, but no promises. So just to get us into the reading, let's see, Micah, could I get you to read for me verses 5 through 8 for me, please? All right, thank you. So where we left off, we sort of read verses 2, 3, and 4, and we talked about light. We talked about the God moving over the waters. So looking at verse 5, we have this separation of light and darkness. God separates the light into what does he call the separation of light? Day. Not a trick question, just trying to wake us all up. He calls it day, and then what does he call the darkness? Night. So we have day and we have night. The light is representative of day. Now, if we are to think of this on a more scientific premise, how do we determine our day-night cycle if we're thinking, to use the Ecclesiastes phrase, under the sun? How do we determine the day-night cycle? Well, you have the sun and the moon, but what is that based upon? Rotation of the earth, exactly. So our planet takes 24 hours to do a full rotation around the earth. And while it is rotating because of the moon, there are times that there's a shadow cast upon the earth where there is night. And then there are times when parts of the earth are exposed to the sun, and we call that day. And it rotates around the world in a 24-hour cycle based upon the rotation of the earth, based upon the sun's gravity. Now, what is missing from that equation when we talk about the first day? The sun, the moon, that we rotate around, and arguably, there may not even be a circular shape to the earth yet, because there's no division of the expanses yet. That I'm not going to argue that very hard, just it's a possibility. We don't know. But what we do know is that there are some things missing that it's hard to think about day and night. So what some will say is that this is there's a certain prose to this, a certain metaphor to this, of light being representative of day, and darkness being representative of night. Light, day, dark, night. And we understand this, I think many of us can come to understand this intrinsically, that there is, we think of symbolically what is representative of light and what is representative of darkness, and we equate those things with day and night. That old saying of, nothing good ever happens after midnight, because, that when the sun is down, when the darkness reigns, when the sun is down. We've really come to encapsulate this sort of idea in our culture and in our minds as human beings, that there is, when it's nighttime, it's dark. There's shadows, there's an absence of light. Then during the day is when things are shining, it's positive, it's happy. And some would argue that God is defining here in a sort of narrative sense the characteristics of day and night. Now, me being simple man, me look and me go, God say day, light day. God say dark night. Okay, that's all I really get from it. But some will look at it and see a slightly deeper meaning. I don't begrudge that, but for me it would just seem, when you go back and you look at the Aramaic, that God uses a word for day and a word for night. When the light is plentiful, uses day. When the darkness is plentiful, uses night. But why is it important that we have a separation of day and night? Look at verse 5. After he separates the day and the night, what then happens? Say that again. It's a day. It has been a cycle. And we call that cycle a day. Not day as in daytime, but a day as in a 24-hour period. Now again, it's hard to call it a 24-hour period when we don't have the rotation of the earth, we don't have all of the celestial bodies yet to really define it, but God uses the word day. That is representative of a period of time. And this is where we'll get into the sort of distinction of, there's a few different theories that come up here. Now when we think of day, when we think of a day has passed, I'll get to you in a second, Ian. When we think of a day has passed, what do we mean by that when we say that phrase? 24 hours has passed, exactly. Now, there's an argument to be made that there is no way for there to be a 24-hour cycle, so that maybe God is using the word day here to simply show a passage of time that is segmented, that has passed, rather than it sticking to a 24-hour period, thinking of it more of a phase or a cycle of time that is used as day, that it's not a literal 24-hour cycle. And some scholars more recently have been comparing the narrative structure and the structure of Genesis 1 to a lot of older Jewish poetry, how it has a lot of the same writing style and time signature in the way that it is written. And I forget the fancy word for in poetry when you use the word signature for prose. I'm sure someone will correct me in a second. But there is a certain consistency with old Jewish poetry in chapter 1, and so that leads some to say that maybe this is a more metaphorical account. And that specifically when it comes to the day and time. Now, I'm not advocating for one way or the other. My point here is, some of you may be going, well, Robert, why are you going into this? Why even bring it up? Because there are those that do believe that there is something to be said here of that there has to be a holding to of a certain natural cycle. That the earth is far older than what traditionally in the past the Church of Christ has held of a sort of young earth creationism. And there's a lot of arguments that stem from this, and I think it's worthwhile for us to take a second and explore how people come to this conclusion, rather than just writing it off, to at least say, hey, this is how people think of this, and come to your own conclusion if it's scripturally consistent. I'll get to my personal opinion a little bit later, but at this point, I'm sure there are a few people who would like to comment, and Ian, you had your hand up, so go ahead. Right.
Right? The next verse and the verse after that, he starts delineating water from land, from earth, from heaven, like just on and on and on. And it's showing, in my opinion, not simply the physical separation, but this more perhaps metaphoric understanding of God is setting order to things. And this is how he's going to delineate essentially these opposites from each other.
And I think that there's an interesting point there, and I think one thing is, it could be both, is that, and I do think it's very significant that you bring up, Ian, when we talk about the fact that you have God clearly pointing out in the first couple of days these opposites, day, night, earth, sea, sky, earth, and separating out the heavens and the earth, these things that are antonyms of one another, or opposites of one another. And it's interesting how they're paired to show God is, like you said, separating out and putting into place these opposite concepts. How do we define day? Well, day is the opposite of night. How do we define night? Night is the opposite of day. The earth is not water, and water is not earth. And in a very, I think there's the physical sense to it of literally, we look up, there's a sky, and beyond that we know there's space, and then we look down and we see the ground. But then there's that concept that God is bringing order, and this is where I very much do agree with you, Ian, is I think in this Genesis account, and I'm glad you brought it up, one of the major themes is God taking the chaos of creation, we get Genesis 1:1, all of it's there, all the stuff is made and it's there, and every day is God bringing more order and definition to the chaotic mess. And each day that passes, there's more definition to the creation. And I think that's a very interesting point there. Carrie, you had your hand up.
It might be more basic than that. If we define eternity by the absence of time,
Mm-hmm.
when the physical realm was created, time was created.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the designation now that using the term day and night, that time has begun, and because that's what we see, the units of time as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Carrie was saying that, now that we have the beginning of time, once time has started, God is starting to use units of measurement of time, of day and night, of a day cycle, to delineate and show that there was an absence of time, and now after Genesis 1:1, there's a definition of time that we now must measure as a passage of a day. It's a great point. Who else had their hand? Kate? Mm-hmm.
And why would you create that time? And just thinking about myself and how I organize things for the students in my class to be able to understand things,
Yeah.
Even really small children, that's not blue, that's green, and ordering things simply. That you have to have, some kind of boundary of time so that people can operate and follow the rules that you set forth according to what you want, and how wise that is that you did that.
Yeah, and that brings up a point that I wanted to make later on. I'm glad you kind of said it, Kate, is we think of this as God's concept of reality, how the plane in which God is and thinks and acts up here, and then, we're way down here. And for us simpletons, as human beings, in comparison to God, we are all simpletons. Even the smartest of us are simpletons in comparison to God. Imagine if God would have said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he created time. And time is a linear experience of how man views a passage of a certain amount of time and its experience in a forward motion. No one would remember that. And all the Jews would be going, what? We can now break it down as we sort of look at it in a more, as adults and as some of us who've been studying the scripture for quite a time, we can go into that slightly deeper level, but God doesn't bring it to us in that deeper level to begin with, because it is, just like you said, Kate, okay, green is not red. How are we going to define day? Well, it's not night. Now, we can go into a bunch of, deeper meaning of, the philosophy between day and night and the metaphor and all this, but the reason that it's put here in these simple terms is because that's the base understanding that we need. There was nothing, now there is something. There is day, and there is night. There was no time, now there's time. There was no earth, now there's earth, and then there's not the earth. And that's a great point. Who else had their hand up? I know, Justin.
One of the primary reasons why I've always believed it to be a 24-hour day is just the vocabulary by itself. But then from the perspective of day 3, you're making all the vegetation, and then day 5, animals pollinate all the plants and all of that stuff. It makes sense that if those things are created on this 24-hour day, and we only have a day or two passing in between, then life goes on as we know it when all the pieces are in play, right? Where otherwise, if it's like millions of years and it's this metaphorical period of time, then not that God couldn't sustain it if he wanted to, but it doesn't seem to flow with the natural that we observe today.
That's an interesting point of how, the 24-hour cycles build upon themselves, and how we understand certain patterns of how animals interact with plant life, and how it would be hard to have that if there's a millions of years of separation. And I think that is an interesting point. I think that's a valid point for the argument for the 24-hour cycle. Jessica?
I was just saying, also, by the time that this is being written as well, Moses is writing this, so the people have a pretty good understanding of what a day is. And So to try to complicate anymore, it's just gonna cause confusion.
Mhm.
So they already have defined by this time point what a day is, and so they know it. So when they're hearing day, they already know what a day is to them.
Right. They have, again, and this this was brought up last week and has been brought up a few times this week, to Jessica's point of that the day is definable, that when Moses is writing this, mankind has already experienced a significant amount of time from Genesis to all the way to the time of Moses in Exodus. There's a lot of time that has passed, and the concept of a day is very definable. And that is a simple concept of a 24-hour period, and God may be using that language explicitly to denote that, though there is still the argument that, well, a day can just be a passage of time that God is giving an organization to, that the unit may not be particularly the unit of measurement. For example, if we look at the expanse, talking a little bit about the second day, space is not literally waters. Someone make that argument to say there is clearly some poetic and metaphorical language within the Genesis account, in that space is not actually water. Space is made up of, well, space, emptiness. And we'll get more into that in a second, but that there is an argument to be made that there is some amount of metaphor in this early part of creation, and that maybe the days are metaphorical. Again, not necessarily what I believe, but that is an argument that does exist. Dana?
I'm just thinking that if we're gonna say the 24 hours is probably not the 24 hours,
Mhm.
because we think God can't do it in that time, that's not logical.
Right.
It's not logical. He can do it in he speaks it and it happens. And when he creates things, they are fully created.
Yeah. And that's a great... Sorry.
I don't think the argument of, the 24 hours didn't start when he made the first day and night.
No, and
Probably, I would think it's 24 hours because in the next verse it's 24 hours.
right. And that, I think, makes a lot of clear sense to me as you put it, that it is logical. But the point that I want you to hold on to is the idea that it is that if we're saying it's not a 24-hour period because God can't make it a 24-hour period, hold on to that thought, because I want to come back to that part of your comment, Dana. Mona, and then Don.
I was just reading ahead. And in 14 and verse 14, the light and expanse of heaven did not do the job of regulating the night, the day, the signs, and the season. Before that, it may just be the definition of the difference between day and night.
Mm-hmm.
Changes in a cycle. Well, it may be 5 minutes, it may be 2 years, it may be 100 years. Up until verse 14, there is no thing that we can relate to in our natural world.
And I think that's also a very fair point of argument of, if we look at verse 14, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be signs for seasons and for days and years. When that happens, there's a clear point that God makes is these are going to be for the signs and delineation of time, and before that, maybe the definition is not clear. The counterpoint to that, of course, being, well, then why use the word day? When that is a definable thing that, man understands quite clearly, back to the point Jessica was making. Don, did you have your hand up?
The important thing is God created.
Yes.
Whether it took 24 hours, 24 million years, in that, whatever that definition was, or he could have made it with, it appears to be 24 million years old with their carbon dating and everything.
Yeah.
Because when he created man, he doesn't say, well, he also created the respiratory system and the circulatory system and the red blood cells and how they interact with the white blood cells.
You're stealing from my notes.
All these things that he did create.
Yeah.
He also created the mechanisms for everything to exist
Mm-hmm.
and perpetuate themselves.
100%, and you're stealing from my notes. Because that was going, when we get to the creation of man, that complexity that, and I'm going to say this very tongue-in-cheek, evolves when we see the massive amount of complexity inside living organisms such as animals and then human beings. And you're right, the 10,000-foot overview of all of this is God created it. And he can create it and have the mechanisms be however he decides for it to be. And I understand for some, that's as far as the argument needs to go. The reason that I want to get into this deeper and have us take a few moments to look at this a little more than just God created, which is the right answer. I want to be clear, that is the right answer. But there are those that might challenge us to say, well, it was millions of years because there had to be an evolutionary process. And see, God uses the natural world and he has to make it, it has to follow these natural laws that we know science has proven, and we see the evolutionary process had to have been worked out through these millions of years, and that's the only way it could have happened. And we have to be, and my whole point in spending some time on this is to make sure that we introduce ourselves to these arguments so that we can better prepare when they're brought to our attention when we're going out and we're talking to people about the scripture. Does that make sense? Because I know for some of us it's like, well, Robert, why are we talking about this in such depth? God made it, God did it how he wants, and at the end of the day, as long as we all acknowledge that God created the world, the details don't really matter. Unless you're talking to someone where is trying to disprove God or to prove a certain point about God, and then if we just say, well, it all happens because God made it happen, that may not be the most convincing argument, and they may go away saying, well, those Christians don't know what they're talking about. Why would I believe in their fairy tale spaghetti monster? I'd say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Cindy, you had your hand up.
God's not making the sun fly. He knows day. They know it. They know
Yes.
what they're doing. He could have made 24 hours and then made the moon that did that. So we need to be careful that we don't limit ourselves too much
Yep.
in this. But when that is the danger of the outside world trying to do that. They want to limit it.
Exactly.
Their scenario. So it gets tricky.
It does get tricky, and again, that's why I want to spend the time on this going through it. Jackie?
Just kind of touch on what Cindy was saying. We are brought up in this society being indoctrinated with atheistic evolution. So we have to be very careful of that. Even though speaking about evolution, like there can be, a creationist perspective about that, but we need to be careful that we're not advocating for atheistic.
Yeah. Atheistic ideas and trying to meld those into Christian ideas. And this jumps me on to the point, I said that I'd share my personal opinion, not that it holds any more weight than anyone else's, is for me, I do land on the young earth creationism of it's a literal 24-hour period, because like Jessica was saying, like Dana was saying, like Jackie was saying, to me, God uses the word day intentionally. If it was going to be nebulous, then I think God would have used a more nebulous term. In a time, in a short time, in a period. And we know God is capable of using such language because he uses it repeatedly in the prophecies of certain eminence phrases. And so it is my personal opinion that it makes more logical sense to be a 24-hour period, because why use day, something that man knows as a 24-hour cycle of it's day for a certain amount of time, it's night for a certain amount of time, and then we have passed the period of day. Why do that and use that language if it is not meant to be literal? And in saying all that, I do want to emphasize what Don said again. I say that is my opinion because I do not think I can get up here as a teacher and tell you all and say, it was without a shadow of a doubt 100% a 24-hour period. I think that would be intellectually dishonest of me, and I also think that that is not what we can say from this passage, because there are, I think, valid scriptural arguments, like a few people have brought up, to say, well, hey, it may have been longer. And I think that's a valid point to make. But want to couch it in this point, which is, as long as, whether you're old earth creationist, young earth creationist, whether you think each day was a cycle of hundreds of thousands, millions of years, as long as we can all acknowledge that God did not have to do it that way, that he could do it in whatever way he chose. Even if you're like me and think it's a 24-hour period, I think we have to acknowledge, if we're being honest about God's power, that he could have done it, that each day could be metaphorical to tens of thousands, millions of years. And on the other side, if you think it is millions or 10,000, whatever, how long you might think it is, that you can acknowledge that God has the power and the ability to make it a 24-hour period. And at that point, I don't think there is any, as long as the argument is couched in that, not saying that God has to do it one way or the other and that God can do it either way, that there's nothing wrong with being on either side of that debate, as long as we acknowledge that one truth, that there is, that God has the power to have done it whatever way he wants. Now, we may hold an opinion that for us in our minds, that one way makes more sense than the other. That's fine. But I do think if we're being honest about the power of God and honest about what we read in Revelation, we cannot say 100% one way or the other about how long the days are. We may have evidence to make it more logical in our minds, and that we cannot exclude that it was not one way or the other, and acknowledging because God has the power to have done it either way. Are we all tracking, and does that make sense? Because I know sometimes we get into this and some people may feel that they're basically being told, well, if you don't think this way, you're a heretic. I don't think that is, I don't think. The scripture is not definitive enough in this section of verses to, I think, really exclude one interpretation or the other, as long as we hold to that one caveat, which is God can do it either way. Now, I have my opinion on the way that makes more sense, and I'll argue that opinion, but it's my opinion. It's not what I can prove 100% from the scripture. Does that make sense? James, you had your hand up.
One problem debating is atheism and evolution is that it's always going to be an issue physical versus spiritual. Because they're trying to solve the question about how we were created, how we began physically using physics, whereas our answer is, well, we were created spiritually. By spiritual beings, we created us physically. So those things can't really mesh with each other, because if they're not going to accept the spiritual power of God, then they're not going to accept the physical nature. I mean, it's going to have the same problem with the book of Joshua, where Joshua literally tells the sun to stop moving, and it literally stops moving, which breaks the laws of physics.
Right.
So if they're not going to accept the spiritual nature that God is what he is, that he can do anything, then, and at which point, since he created the laws of physics, matches it, breaks it, then they're not going to believe whatever counter arguments we have, whether it's 24 hours, whether it's 1,000 years.
And I think that is a great point, and I don't disagree with you really, James, and that's at all, but I would add on to what you're saying is one of the reasons when personally I talk to atheists, I don't start with book, chapter, verse. I start with these sort of philosophical arguments for the existence of God that use the evidence from Genesis, from Psalms, that talk about the natural creation, how it sings of the existence of God, and we see that in Romans chapter 1, verse 18 as well, it is there has to be a first step. And that first step is getting people that believe in nothing supernatural to believe in a creator. And then we go from there to show the evidence that that creator is Jehovah God. Because what people do is exactly what you say, James, which is, well, my science rejects this. But my smallest pushback would be that science also can prove and show the logic of the existence of God. We are not beholden to it and locked. I apologize, someone said it about kind of being locked into the box and limiting God. As long as, I think it was you, Don, that mentioned that, as long as we acknowledge and don't try to limit God to the physical world, we can still use the physical world to prove the existence of God. That being the science, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the expanse here in a few moments and the what the atmosphere is made up of. But I do agree with you, James, is we do have to make sure with some people that we're not putting the cart in front of the horse and trying to argue something, saying, well, God did this. Well, I don't believe in God. Okay, we have to go a step back further and say, let's at least acknowledge that there's some sort of intelligent designer, creator, and then we go the next step, which is to show that that being is Jehovah God. Ian?
Touching on that, and to Don's point as well, very much a hermeneutical viewpoint. The Bible is not a scientific textbook.
Nope.
It's just not. It was, I'll even go a step further, the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. And so there's viewpoints that
Mhm.
ought to be taken, that we have to sort of
Yes.
to the table that are important to us in a sense. So
Right.
again, to the argue with the atheist, well, science says this and that, that's fine. I may not even disagree with that. The Bible itself may not disagree with it either because it's not a scientific text.
Right.
It does not explain, as Don had said, you're touch on the complexity of human life and the body itself. And it does not go into that because that's not what's important. The important fact is God brings chaos into order
Mhm.
and gives it to us as his gift. And then the rest that proceeds from it.
And I want to be clear that I'm not trying to say that the Bible is a scientific textbook. I'm glad that you bring that clarity to it. This passage, if we're going to again look from the 10,000-foot overview, is what Kate was saying. We need to know that green is not red and red is not green. To use that analogy again, that's a great point. Carrie?
What makes it all difficult, I think Jackie referred to it, is our modern language.
Yes.
The term theory of evolution has been around for 100 years.
Has it been that long?
Society has slowly dropped the first two words,
Yeah.
and yet it remains a theory. If you look at the science of evolution, it actually patterns or parallels to religion. It's based on faith and has its own priesthood, and they simply reject people who disagree with them, and any science, what they call science, that disagrees.
And I think that's also an excellent point, as Carrie was saying, that, we have to understand that man has taken things that are theories that are not 100% provable, that are still an idea, they are not a law, but man in our day and age has taken things that are theories and say that they are fact. And that's a great thing to remember, is that, and I love that point you said, Carrie, that religion, science, is that really early science was used to prove religion, to prove the existence of, or for those that are skeptical, to show, I don't want to say prove, to show evidence. There was the word I was looking for. To show evidence for the existence of God. That is what apologetics is. And as a very quick side note, some may bristle at saying the word philosophy. Let's use philosophy. Well, the Greek meaning of philosophy is literally the study of God, or the study of little g God. Philosophy was used to prove the logical consistency of a divine creator. That was its original purpose. But I want to wrap all this up because it does not feel like we've went through all of class, but we pretty much have. I feel like we just started like 10 minutes ago. And I'm not kidding. It does not feel like we've been here for that long. I do want to touch on something very quickly to kind of have your minds thinking about for next week. In verse 6, then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above, and it was so, and then God called the expanse heaven. Here's where we see the formation of, we call it the horizon or the expanse, but there is a clear separation of the waters above, or the waters above and the waters below. This is the earth getting a shape and a separation from space, from the heavens. And we name that expanse now. Instead of the expanse, what do we call the separation between our earth and space? There's a word for that we use now. Atmosphere, exactly. So the point that I want to leave you on is just a teensy bitsy bit of homework. I know I bristle with that word too. I kind of want to spit when I say it. If you're curious this week and you want some homework, look up what makes up our atmosphere and look up how much variability there can be in the mixture of our atmosphere. And we'll talk, for those of you overachievers that do that, we're going to talk about that next week. We're going to talk about the atmosphere and why that's important, and about how amazing, just something that we don't even see, how that can prove the existence of God. So with that, we'll close with one last announcement. Teachers, if you can meet in room 7 after class, if you're going to be a teacher for the summer quarter, you're asked to meet in room 7 after the closing prayer. With that being said, let us go ahead and have a closing prayer. Dan Stitt, would you mind leading us in closing word of prayer?